On the day that I was born in 1970 in Los Angeles, California, my father went home that night and he wrote me a letter. And he sealed it up in the envelope, and he wrote on the outside, "To Julia, to be opened on her 21st birthday." And all those years later, when I got to open the letter, it was a beautiful window into the thoughts of a young man at the turn of the decade. But there's always one part of the letter that has stood out to me, and it's when he wrote, "Peace and love are the symbols of the year that you were born. Vietnam is a sadness we all share. Ecology, smog in LA. The world talks of great things, but right now it doesn't feel like a very beautiful place for a little girl like you." And I've often reflected on these moments of history that we're born into. And I think about the fact that my father, too, was born during a time of war, while his father was away at World War II. And then 2 generations later, my daughter was born in 2001. And I'll never forget what it felt like to hold her in my arms as the Twin Towers fell on 9/11, and to think to myself, the world still doesn't feel like a very beautiful place for a little girl like her. How many of you have these universal feelings about the next generation, and we're full of hope and joy and even perhaps dread and concern when we think about the world's problems? And how many of us feel hopeless to do anything or helpless to construct peace? How many of you out there may consider yourself a peace builder? Because I do. I'm now a part of a profession of peace building, and I have the great fortune to work with organizations and wonderful people around the world through our network, Partners Global, who are working across the globe to bring peace and democracy and stability, and also a little bit closer to home, here in Bratislava, where my colleagues at Partners Slovakia were some of the first on the front lines, helping to bring a peaceful transition to democracy to this part of the world. And after almost 20 years now of working in this profession, I've come to realize how important it is that all of us are jointly working for peace. It's not just the professionals, it's not just the politicians, but it's everyday citizens. And I have some observations about why it is that the multitudes of caring and motivated people have a difficult time perhaps thinking of yourselves as peace builders, how we stay in our silos, and we have a difficult time collaborating on shared goals. Because we know from neuroscientists that each of us hold very deeply held beliefs about our own identity and who we consider as the other. And our mind very easily makes generalizations, and we filter all information emotionally, and we act on those emotions. So for example, when I say that I am a peace builder, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? Perhaps you think of a UN peacekeeper with a blue hat. Maybe you think of an anti-war protester, a far-out hippie. Or maybe you think of some of the world's biggest leaders high up on a pedestal of unattainable heroism. Today, I'd like to paint a different picture, and I'd like to do that by naming 5 misperceptions about what it means to be a peace builder, in the hopes that perhaps you may have a slight shift in how you perceive yourself and others, and the possibility of the contribution that you can make for a more peaceful world. So the first misperception about building peace is you may think that we're only working to bring an end to violence and war. And we've learned a lot from the medical profession over the years about how they deal with illness. And we know that health professionals don't just study and treat sick people, but they're actively promoting all of those factors that keep us in overall health. Right now, you're hearing a lot about some of those countries and regions that are experiencing extreme illness. Ukraine, Yemen, Syria, South Sudan, Central America. There are many wonderfully courageous professional diplomats and humanitarians and activists that are working hard to bring an end to those conflicts and human suffering. But peace is much more than just the absence of violence. It's about how we're increasing the overall health of our societies so that we have resiliency to ward off the potential outbreak of violent conflict. We refer to this now as positive peace. And there's an organization called the Institute for Economics and Peace that are carefully studying these trends of what keeps a country peaceful. So you may be wondering, what are these trends? Or what are these factors? And I'll name them for you. There's 8 of them. Peaceful countries demonstrate a sound business environment. They have high levels of human capital. They have good relations with neighboring countries. There's an acceptance of the rights of others. There's low levels of corruption. There's well-functioning governments. There's the free flow and access to information. And there's the equitable distribution of resources. So as I was naming those 8 factors, I wonder if you find yourself in these areas in some way. Perhaps you're a journalist, and you're working to shine a light on how the government is spending its money. Maybe you're an educator, or you work for the municipal government. Maybe you work for human rights, gay rights, women's rights. Maybe you have a business, so you're thinking of starting a business. Or maybe you just like to travel, and you're a part of creating those positive relations with your neighboring countries. Because you might be interested to know that one of the countries that fell the most percentage points on the Positive Peace Index in this last year was Hungary. So all of us need to be mindful of these trends and the role that we all play in society within a complex social system that's helping us establish our resiliency and create positive peace. So the second misperception about peace builders is that you may think we're anti-military or somehow against the security sector. I personally believe that our expenditures on military spending globally have reached astronomical rates. Almost $1.7 trillion in 2015 was spent on military alone. And what a better investment of our time and resources if we just took a fraction of that spending and we invested it into these societal aspects of positive peace. But I've also come to recognize the very legitimate and important role of a well-functioning security sector. I'll give you an example of where this has been really important, is during the recent Ebola outbreak in West Africa, when there were several of my colleagues that were working quite closely with those men and women in uniform that were sent to the porous borders of Guinea and Sierra Leone and Liberia to work with those populations to stem the flow of people crossing the borders and the further spread of the disease. And at a time of great tension and grief and misinformation and the potential for the outbreak of violence, this cooperation with those security forces was key so that those populations would voluntarily and peacefully follow new norms of crossing the borders so that they could further stem the tide of Ebola. The thing about peace is I think perhaps we don't truly appreciate it until its absence. And we need the security forces and law enforcement to help us keep the peace. But right now, globally, we are having some very difficult debates on the needed transformation of the role between law enforcement and the communities that they serve. Whether it's Tunis, or Rio, or Paris, or Baltimore, unfortunately, there is a history of some in law enforcement abusing their authority. And the resulting protest movements and debates are bringing about very needed institutional reforms. But just as important is how we are building bridges and reconstructing trusting relationships between people and the multitude of very good policemen and women who are doing their job and trying to do the best to achieve the same goals we all have for a safe and secure environment for our families. If you would like to make a difference for peace, I would invite you to think about the roles that you could play, small and big, in supporting those security forces and law enforcement to do the very difficult job that they're called on to do. We know that change is needed, and so I would also invite you to lend your voices to those conversations that are unfolding about the right role of the security sector in your neighborhood and also in your nation. So the third misperception about building peace is that you may think that religion is one of the biggest sources of conflict in today's world. We all share a growing concern with the rise of religious extremism and its tragic consequences in the Middle East and some very sensational attacks here in Europe. And while there are thousands of different stories of the men and women who are choosing to join those extremist movements, we've seen largely that their grievances are based mostly on social exclusion and not primarily a battle over religion. They're looking for fairness and dignity and a sense of community. In fact, the Arab Spring protest movement started in Tunisia by a man who lit himself on fire because he felt that he was being treated unfairly by an unjust system that was keeping him impoverished and voiceless. Extremism isn't something that's just happening over there. All of us, with societies with an influx of immigration and growing diverse societies, we have to deal with this issue of social inclusion because, as I mentioned, one of the factors of positive peace is the fundamental respect and protection of human rights. So there's something very easy that all of you can do to build a more peaceful world, and it's to think about seeing others that are different from you, culturally, racially, ethnically, religiously, as deserving of voice and basic human dignity. Because unfortunately, there are those that use religious distinctions to instill fear and to make even deeply more embedded those perceptions that we have as other. But we know that Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, Jewish, even atheist, we are a powerful majority of believers in peace, and we are more alike than we are different. So the fourth misperception about building peace is you may think young people are the next generation or the ones who are going to bring about the real change. In many parts of the world, we have a youth bulge, and sometimes we have negative connotations about youth unemployment and criminality and political disillusionment. But we've also seen how young people are bringing wonderful new energy and creativity to helping to solve these world problems through social media and the arts. And in my circles in the international development community, I've seen almost a cult of youth unfold. Get behind and work with the young people, and then we'll see real change. And this is absolutely true. But I would also like to make a call for multi-generational unity. I was recently in a meeting with a group of Russian activists, young and old, and I was alarmed at the level of fragmentation and mistrust in this group that were brought together seemingly for the similar goals of a more peaceful and democratic Russia. The older generation clearly felt that their experience was not being valued, and the younger group in the room were very mistrustful of what they saw as hierarchical, top-down leadership models. And this doesn't just happen in Russia. I've seen it all over the world. And in my own country, there's a new movement that has recently grown out of the horrific police brutality cases, the Black Lives Matter movement. And when Oprah Winfrey publicly criticized the movement to say it was lacking leadership, these young activists fought back on the press and said that the older generation had long ago sold out and they were out of touch with the real needs of the Black community. And in both of these situations, I kept thinking to myself, don't they all just really want the same thing at the end of the day? Because if we want positive peace, one of our biggest assets is our human capital. And so if you would like to be building peace, think about finding a young person to mentor to reach their full potential. And in this room full of wonderful young energy, I would invite you to seek out new allies looking beyond age. I think some of us may see different paths to get to where we're going, but ultimately we do want to get to the same destination. And so my fifth misperception, my final one about peace building, is you may think that we're somehow against big business. As I mentioned, one of the biggest drivers of social conflict is social inequality and income disparity. And in many ways, our global economic system is broken. And greed and corruption are causing some of the world's poor living in the most violent and conflictive countries in the world. And this leads many in my social circles to be very wary of businesses and wealthy elites. But the truth of the matter is that businesses have a stake in peaceful societies, and the majority of them see it that way. And we now know more and more that the role of business is not necessarily just to make financial profit, but it's also about achieving environmental sustainability and social good. And they have to do that with partnerships with other sectors. The corporate world all over the globe now more frequently talks about the triple bottom line. The other way of putting that is the 3 Ps: people, planet, profit. And now we've added a 4th P, peace. Because we know that businesses, they create needed jobs, but they can also spur tolerance in divided societies by their workforce and hiring diverse people. They invest in needed infrastructure, like the telecommunications industry, making a huge contribution to social development in sub-Saharan Africa. Not only do they donate to social programs, but even more importantly, they lend their talents to social causes. For example, we're working with a very large advertising agency to help us sell peace in Colombia. Sometimes I hear in my peace-building community, yeah, but the businesses are the bad guys. They're selfishly just out to make a profit. And I would ask you to check those generalizations. And if you're a business leader, take stock of how your everyday operations, how you treat employees, is making a contribution to this complex societal system of positive peace. Because this brings me to my last point that I'd like to leave you with. I've seen that some of the biggest roadblocks that we face in dealing with the complex systems of positive peace lies within our individual relationships and our ability to have empathy with others. Peace is something that each of us construct on a daily basis, both in good times and especially in difficult ones. And each and every one of you have the possibility to make a contribution through your actions. Think about listening more. And if there's an issue that you truly care about, try and see that problem from different perspectives, because then you can reach out to others who may share your similar goals. Try your best to break down these silos and to test your own assumptions and perceptions. This is the DNA of peace building. When we reach out to others that we might not normally reach out to, maybe it's a policeman or a business person or a religious leader or a young man or an older woman, all of us collectively can think of ourselves as peace builders. Because if you went home tonight and you wrote a letter to your children or somebody else that you love to be opened in the future, what would you say? And how many commonalities would we find in those letters? This is how my father ended his letter to me. He wrote, "I pray that you find what you want in life. Don't be narrow-minded. Don't hurt others. Find what you love doing and spend as much time as possible doing it. Have a good life. Your every hurt and every happiness will be a part of the lives of your mother and mine." Thank you.